October 5th, 1943, 30 miles northeast of Wake Island. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below like hammered steel beneath a crystalline sky. Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda throttled back his Mitsubishi A6M0 as he scanned the horizon through the morning haze. 9 American aircraft marked his propeller spinner, 9 Wildcats that had fallen to the climbing loop that had become his signature kill. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Lure the American into a vertical climb, wait for their heavier fighter to stall and tumble, then wing over and destroy them as they struggled to recover. It had worked 9 times, without fail. The silhouette approaching from the southeast looked familiar. Inverted gull wings, radial engine, the distinctive profile of a Grumman fighter climbing through 15,000 feet. Another Wildcat, Sueda assumed, pushing his throttle forward to engage. What he could not know, what no intelligence briefing had adequately conveyed, was that the aircraft closing on his position was not a Wildcat at all. It was an F6F Hellcat powered by 2,000 horsepower of Pratt & Whitney engineering that would fundamentally alter everything Japanese pilots believed about American fighter capabilities. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. When it concluded, Sueda's Zero was tumbling earthward, trailing black smoke, and Ensign Robert Duncan of Fighting Squadron 5 had become the first American pilot to shoot down a Zero while flying a Hellcat. More significantly, Duncan had demonstrated what would become a defining characteristic of Pacific air combat for the remainder of the war. American fighters could now climb with Japanese aircraft at altitudes where the Zero had previously dominated, negating the tactical advantages that had made Japanese pilots invincible since Pearl Harbor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning of April 26th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare walked through the factory floor at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, his eyes tracking the skeletal frames of fighters under construction in the massive assembly hall. 6 weeks had passed since O'Hare had earned the Medal of Honor for single-handedly defending the carrier Lexington against a formation of Japanese bombers, and 3 months since the disaster at Pearl Harbor had revealed the brutal effectiveness of Japanese naval aviation. The purpose of his visit was clear. Grumman's engineers needed to understand precisely what American pilots faced when engaging the Mitsubishi A6M0 in aerial combat. The conference room contained blueprints, performance charts, and captured gun camera footage from the few American pilots who had survived encounters with Japanese fighters. O'Hare described the Zero's capabilities with the clinical precision of a combat veteran who understood that his observations might determine whether future American aviators lived or died. The Japanese fighter could outturn anything the United States Navy currently operated. Its rate of climb exceeded American specifications by margins that enabled Zero pilots to establish altitude advantage before engagements began. Most troubling, the Zero's range permitted operations at distances American commanders had believed impossible for carrier-based fighters. Roy Grumman, the company's founder and chief designer, listened as O'Hare detailed engagement after engagement where American pilots flying F4F Wildcats had been forced into defensive tactics that ceded initiative to Japanese formations. The Wildcat was a rugged aircraft, capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy lighter fighters, but it could not climb with the Zero at medium altitudes, could not turn with Japanese pilots in sustained engagements, and lacked the speed to escape unfavorable tactical situations through acceleration alone. The technical specifications that emerged from these discussions would define the Hellcat's development. The new fighter required an engine powerful enough to match or exceed Zero climb rates above 10,000 feet. It needed structural strength sufficient to permit diving attacks at speeds that would tear wings from lighter aircraft. Most critically, it demanded sufficient armor protection and firepower to ensure that when American pilots achieved firing positions, they could deliver decisive damage before Japanese maneuverability could negate their advantage. 4 days after O'Hare's visit to Bethpage, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a directive that would transform Grumman's development program. The second F6F prototype, currently under construction with Wright's twin Cyclone engine, would be redesigned to accommodate the Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine. The power plant had already proven itself in the Corsair, generating 2,000 horsepower at takeoff and maintaining power output at altitudes where other engines began to lose performance. Installing it in the Hellcat's airframe would create a fighter with capabilities that could challenge Japanese tactical doctrine. The engineering challenges were substantial. The R2800 weighed 400 pounds, more than the twin Cyclone, requiring structural reinforcement throughout the forward fuselage and engine mounts. The increased power demanded a larger propeller, necessitating modifications to the landing, gear, and engine cowling design. Cooling requirements for the more powerful engine required enlarged air intakes and oil cooler installations that added drag but prevented catastrophic overheating during sustained combat operations. By July 30th, 1942, barely 3 months after the Bureau's directive, the redesigned F6F prototype lifted from Grumman's test facility at Bethpage. The test pilot's report documented performance characteristics that exceeded optimistic projections. Maximum level speed at 19,000 feet approached 380 miles per hour, 60 miles per hour faster than the Zero's best performance at optimal altitude. Rate of climb measured 3,400 feet per minute under war emergency power, enabling the Hellcat to reach 20,000 feet in less than 7 minutes. But the specification that would prove most significant for tactical development appeared in the detailed performance charts compiled during the subsequent test flights. Below 14,000 feet, the Zero maintained its advantage in rate of climb, ascending faster than the Hellcat through the lower altitude bands where Japanese pilots had established their dominance. Above 14,000 feet, the Hellcat's superior engine power and optimized propeller design enabled it to match and then exceed the Zero's climbing performance. At 15,000 feet, the American fighter could outclimb its Japanese opponent. At 20,000 feet, the advantage became decisive. The tactical implications extended beyond simple performance numbers. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized achieving altitude advantage before engaging enemy formations, a strategy that relied on the Zero's superior climb rate to establish energy dominance. If American fighters could now climb at rates comparable to Japanese aircraft at medium and high altitudes, that fundamental tactical framework collapsed. Zero pilots would no longer possess guaranteed energy superiority, would no longer be able to dictate engagement parameters through altitude advantage alone. By January 1943, production F6F Hellcats began rolling off Grumman's assembly lines at rates that exceeded 500 aircraft per month. The manufacturing achievement reflected American industrial capacity operating at scales Japanese planners had never anticipated. Where Zero production struggled to maintain 200 aircraft per month amid material shortages and bombing disruption, Grumman's Bethpage facility could produce more Hellcats in a single month than Japan's entire fighter aircraft industry could manufacture in 3. The first combat deployment occurred in August 1943, when Fighting Squadron 5, equipped with 36 Hellcats, embarked aboard the USS Yorktown for operations in the Central Pacific. The squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Edward Owen, had studied engagement reports from Wildcat units, analyzed captured Zero performance data, and developed tactical doctrine specifically designed to exploit the Hellcat's advantages while minimizing Japanese strengths in turning combat. Owen's tactical guidance emphasized 3 core principles. First, maintain altitude advantage whenever possible, using the Hellcat's superior climb rate above 15,000 feet to establish energy dominance before engagement. Second, avoid sustained turning combat where Zero maneuverability could negate American advantages in speed and firepower. And third, exploit the Hellcat's diving performance and structural strength to execute high-speed attack runs that Japanese pilots could not follow without risking structural failure of their lighter airframes. The squadron's pilots most of whom had never fired their guns in combat, absorbed these lessons during the transit to forward operating areas. Among them was Ensign Robert Duncan, a 22-year-old aviator from Marion, Illinois, who had completed flight training 6 months earlier. Duncan had logged barely 300 hours of flight time, far less than the 1,000-hour minimums that Japanese pilots accumulated before their first combat assignments. But American training doctrine emphasized standardized procedures and coordinated tactics over individual skill development, creating aviators who could function effectively as components of larger tactical systems rather than relying on personal expertise alone. The squadron's introduction to combat came on August 31st, 1943, during a raid against Marcus Island, a Japanese outpost 1,500 miles southeast of Tokyo. The mission profile called for Hellcats to establish air superiority over the target area, while dive bombers attacked shore installations and shipping. Intelligence estimated light fighter opposition, perhaps a dozen Zeros operating from the island's single airfield. What the pilots encountered was different than expected. 24 Japanese fighters rose to meet the American formation, their polished aluminum surfaces flashing in morning sunlight as they climbed aggressively toward the incoming raiders. The Hellcat pilots, following Owen's tactical guidance, maintained their altitude advantage while the Japanese formation attempted to establish position for coordinated attacks against the bomber elements. The first Zero to commit to an attack run found itself under fire from 2 Hellcats executing a high-side approach that brought them down on the Japanese fighter at a 45-degree angle. The coordinated attack, practiced repeatedly during training flights but never executed in combat conditions, worked precisely as designed. Both American pilots triggered their .50 caliber machine guns simultaneously, delivering a combined weight of fire that literally disintegrated the Zero's unarmored fuselage. The Japanese aircraft tumbled earthward, shedding aluminum fragments, its pilot killed instantly by rounds that had penetrated the cockpit from multiple angles. Duncan watched the engagement develop while maintaining position in the 2nd Division's tactical formation. His wingman flew 300 feet to his right, close enough to provide mutual support, but far enough to avoid collision during maneuvering. The coordination between division members reflected hundreds of hours of formation practice, creating spatial awareness that enabled rapid tactical response without requiring detailed radio communication. A Zero, attempting to establish firing position against the dive bombers, appeared in Duncan's vision, climbing steeply through 12,000 feet on a trajectory that would bring it into firing range within seconds. Duncan rolled, inverted, and pulled his Hellcat into a split S maneuver, building speed rapidly as he dove toward the climbing Zero. At 400 yards, he centered the Japanese fighter in his gun sight and triggered a 2-second burst. The 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns fired in sequence, their combined output delivering nearly 3,000 rounds per minute against a target that possessed no armor protection whatsoever. The Zero's engine exploded under the impact of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that punched through aluminum cowling as though it were paper. Coolant and oil sprayed across Duncan's windscreen as he pulled up from his diving attack, his Hellcat's structural strength easily absorbing the G-forces that would have torn wings from a lighter aircraft. Below, the Zero corkscrewed earthward trailing flame, its pilot trapped in a cockpit filled with burning aviation fuel. The engagement continued for 18 minutes, with individual combats occurring across multiple altitude levels simultaneously. Japanese pilots, attempting to employ traditional turning tactics, found themselves engaged by Hellcat pairs that refused to accept turning combat, instead using speed and altitude advantage to execute boom and zoom attacks that struck from unexpected angles. Every time a Zero pilot attempted to turn inside an American formation, the Hellcats would accelerate away, climb rapidly to re-establish energy advantage, then return for another high-speed attack run. By the time the last Japanese fighters withdrew toward their base, 8 Zeros had been confirmed, destroyed, against no American losses. The dive bombers completed their mission without interference, destroying fuel storage facilities and damaging the airfield sufficiently to prevent effective operations for several weeks. More significantly, Fighting Squadron 5 had demonstrated that properly trained American pilots flying Hellcats could engage elite Japanese fighter units on equal terms and emerge victorious. The post-mission debrief aboard Yorktown revealed tactical lessons that would be distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet fighter community. The Hellcat's performance at medium and high altitudes had exceeded even optimistic projections. Several pilots reported outclimbing pursuing Zeros above 15,000 feet, negating Japanese attempts to establish energy advantage through superior climb rates. The aircraft's structural strength permitted diving attacks at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, far beyond anything Japanese fighters could safely achieve. Lieutenant Commander Owen's report to Pacific Fleet Headquarters emphasized the psychological impact of the engagement on Japanese tactical confidence. Zero pilots, accustomed to dominating aerial combat through superior maneuverability and climb performance, had encountered an opponent that matched their climb rates at medium altitudes while exceeding Japanese capabilities in speed, dive performance, and firepower. The tactical framework that had made Japanese naval aviation invincible since the war began was breaking down under the impact of American technological and industrial advantages that overwhelmed individual pilot skill. September 1943 brought additional Hellcat squadrons into combat operations throughout the Central Pacific. Fighting Squadron 9 aboard Enterprise, Fighting Squadron 2 aboard Bunker Hill, and Marine Fighting Squadron 213. Operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, all transitioned to the new fighter, bringing accumulated combat experience to bear on optimizing tactical employment against Japanese opposition. The tactical doctrine evolved rapidly as more squadrons gained combat experience. The vertical battlefield became the American domain, with Hellcat formations operating at altitudes between 18,000 and 25,000 feet, where their superior high-altitude performance could be fully exploited. Japanese pilots attempting to engage at these altitudes found themselves fighting opponents who could outclimb them, outdive them, and deliver concentrated firepower that their unarmored aircraft could not survive. October 5, 1943, marked Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda's final combat mission. Operating from Rabaul with the veteran 204th Air Group, Sueda had survived 22 months of continuous combat operations that had taken him from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the grinding attrition battles over Guadalcanal. His 9 confirmed victories represented extraordinary achievement in an air force that was hemorrhaging experienced pilots at unsustainable rates. The morning briefing at Rabaul had identified American carrier operations near Wake Island, with intelligence reporting possible fighter sweeps designed to establish air superiority before amphibious landings. Sueda's formation, 12 Zeros from the 204th, would intercept American formations while maintaining sufficient altitude to exploit their superior climb rates during engagement. The tactical plan was sound, based on 2 years of combat experience that had validated Japanese fighter doctrine across dozens of successful engagements. What the intelligence briefing had failed to adequately convey was the nature of the American fighters now operating in the theater. The silhouettes, identified as Wildcats, were actually Hellcats, a distinction that reconnaissance photographs and pilot reports had not clearly established. At 22,000 feet, Sueda's formation made contact with 16 American fighters approaching from the southeast. The Grumman silhouettes looked familiar, inverted gull wings and radial engines that suggested the slower, less capable Wildcats that Sueda had engaged successfully throughout his combat career. He rolled into a diving attack that would build speed for his signature climbing loop, the tactical maneuver that had destroyed 9 American fighters through technique and timing rather than raw performance. The American formation responded differently than Wildcat pilots had in previous engagements. Instead of attempting to follow Sueda into his climbing attack, 2 Hellcats accelerated past him, then pulled up into steep climbs that matched his Zero's vertical performance. At 15,500 feet altitude, where Wildcats would have stalled and tumbled away, the American fighters were still climbing smoothly, their powerful engines maintaining thrust that exceeded anything Sueda had encountered. Ensign Duncan, flying one of the pursuing Hellcats, watched his airspeed indicator carefully as he pulled his aircraft into a vertical climb that followed the Zero's trajectory. at 170 miles per hour, a speed that would have caused a Wildcat to stall completely. The Hellcat continued climbing steadily. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 maintained full power output, driving the three-blade propeller with authority that translated directly into continuing vertical performance. At the apex of Sueda's loop, the moment when he would normally wing over to destroy the stalled American fighter below, Duncan triggered his guns. The 50 caliber rounds converged on the Zero's unarmored fuselage from a range of 200 yards, punching through aluminum structure and severing control cables that left Sueda's aircraft unresponsive to control inputs. The Zero rolled inverted and entered a flat spin that would carry it 22,000 feet to the ocean surface. Duncan recovered from his vertical climb and rejoined his division, unaware that the pilot he had just destroyed was a 9-victory ace whose tactical technique had killed more experienced aviators than Duncan had accumulated flight hours. The engagement had demonstrated what combat testing and performance analysis had predicted. The Hellcat could match Zero climb performance at altitudes above 15,000 feet, negating the tactical advantage that had made Japanese fighter doctrine effective since the war began. The tactical reports flowing into Japanese naval headquarters throughout October and November 1943 painted an increasingly grim picture. Squadron commanders reported unprecedented losses during engagements with American fighters, losses that could not be explained by pilot error or mechanical failure. The common thread connecting these defeats was the presence of the F6F Hellcat, an aircraft the Japanese intelligence had failed to adequately assess during its rapid development and deployment. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most experienced fighter tacticians and a veteran of Pearl Harbor, analyzed combat reports from units throughout the Central Pacific. The patterns were unmistakable. Zero pilots attempting to employ traditional climbing attacks found themselves matched or exceeded by American fighters above 15,000 feet. Formations attempting to establish altitude advantage before engagement discovered that Hellcats could climb at rates comparable to Japanese aircraft at medium and high altitudes, negating the energy dominance that had made Zero tactics effective. The technical analysis that accompanied Genda's report detailed specific performance characteristics that challenged fundamental assumptions about American aircraft design. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine maintained power output at altitudes where Japanese engines began losing performance. The supercharger installation, optimized for high-altitude operations, enabled sustained power delivery above 20,000 feet, creating performance advantages that grew more pronounced as altitude increased. But performance specifications alone did not explain the comprehensive nature of American tactical success. Japanese pilots reported that Hellcat formations operated with coordination that suggested extensive training in specific tactical procedures designed to maximize aircraft capabilities. The Americans refused turning engagements where Zero maneuverability could dominate, instead executing high-speed attack runs that exploited superior diving performance and structural strength. When Japanese pilots attempted to force close-range combat, Hellcat formations would separate, maintain mutual support through radio communication, then re-engage with altitude and energy advantages that Japanese tactics could not counter. The industrial implications proved equally troubling. By December 1943, intelligence estimates suggested that American factories were producing Hellcats at rates exceeding 500 aircraft per month. Zero production, hampered by material shortages and increasingly effective American bombing campaigns against Japanese industry, struggled to maintain 200 fighters per month. The quantitative advantage that had characterized Japanese naval aviation during the war's opening phase had reversed completely, creating numerical superiority that enabled American commanders to accept loss ratios that would have been unsustainable for Japanese forces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. November 23, 1943, over Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. The engagement that would cement the Hellcat's reputation as the dominant Pacific fighter began with routine radar contacts detected by ships of Task Force 53, 30 Japanese aircraft approaching from the north climbing through 12,000 feet on trajectories that would bring them into contact with American forces supporting the amphibious assault on Betio Island. Commander Edward Owen, leading 24 Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 5, acknowledged the tactical controller's position report and adjusted his formation to intercept. The American fighters held altitude advantage at 22,000 feet, positioned between the approaching Japanese formation and the invasion fleet below. The tactical situation favored aggressive engagement, using superior altitude to establish energy dominance before Japanese pilots could reach their intended targets. At 18,000 feet, Owen could distinguish individual aircraft in the Japanese formation, their silver aluminum surfaces reflecting morning sunlight as they climbed steadily toward the American position. The tactical doctrine developed through 3 months of combat experience dictated immediate action. Hellcat divisions would attack in succession, each 4 aircraft elements striking the Japanese formation from different angles to prevent coordinated defensive response. Owen rolled inverted and pulled his Hellcat into a steep diving attack that built speed rapidly past 400 miles per hour. The formation followed in sequence, divisions entering the attack at intervals that maintained continuous pressure against Japanese formations, attempting to organize defensive tactics. At 800 yards, Owen triggered his guns, the 6 50-caliber machine guns, delivering a combined weight of fire that no unarmored aircraft could survive. The first Zero disintegrated under the impact of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that punched through aluminum structure and ignited fuel tanks with devastating effectiveness. 3 seconds elapsed between Owen's initial trigger pull and the moment the Japanese aircraft exploded in a fireball visible from ships 40 miles distant. The systematic destruction that followed established performance benchmarks that would define American fighter operations for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu, flying division leader in the second element, counted 4 Zeros attempting to escape the initial attack by diving toward cloud cover at 8,000 feet. The tactical response was immediate. Vrachu rolled his Hellcat into a pursuit dive that accelerated past 450 miles per hour, speeds that would have torn wings from lighter Japanese aircraft. The structural strength engineered into the Hellcat's airframe enabled pursuit tactics that Japanese pilots could not match without risking catastrophic structural failure. At 6,000 feet, Vrachu closed to 400 yards behind the lead Zero and triggered a 3-second burst. The Japanese fighter's engine exploded, coolant and oil spraying across empty air as the aircraft tumbled toward the ocean surface. Vrachu's wingman destroyed a second Zero before the remaining Japanese aircraft separated, attempting to use individual maneuverability to escape pursuit. The engagement continued for 19 minutes, with individual combats occurring across multiple altitude levels as Japanese pilots attempted to employ every tactical technique that had proven effective during earlier phases of the war. Turning engagements failed, as Hellcat pilots refused to accept slow-speed combat, instead using superior speed and climb rate to establish firing positions that negated Japanese maneuverability advantages. Altitude advantage proved illusory, as American fighters demonstrated the ability to climb at rates comparable to Zeros above 15,000 feet. When the last Japanese aircraft withdrew toward their base on Maloelap, 30 enemy fighters had been confirmed destroyed against the loss of a single Hellcat damaged by defensive fire. The kill ratio, 30-1, it exceeded even optimistic projections for American fighter performance. More significantly, the engagement demonstrated that properly trained pilots flying Hellcats could achieve complete tactical dominance over experienced Japanese formations employing proven combat techniques. The post-mission analysis conducted aboard USS Yorktown revealed tactical patterns that would be distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet fighter community within weeks. Japanese pilots had attempted to employ every advantage their aircraft and training provided, yet none had proven effective against American formations operating under doctrines specifically designed to exploit Hellcat capabilities while minimizing Zero strengths. The vertical battlefield had become American territory, with superior high-altitude performance, enabling tactical flexibility that Japanese doctrine could not counter. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding carrier operations in the Central Pacific, reviewed the Tarawa engagement reports with particular attention to the tactical implications for upcoming operations. The planned assault on the Marshall Islands would require sustained air superiority over Japanese bases capable of launching counterattacks against invasion forces. The Hellcats demonstrated ability to achieve decisive victories against elite Japanese units, suggested that American fighters could now operate with confidence against any opposition the enemy could deploy. By January 1944, Hellcat squadrons had replaced Wildcats aboard every fleet carrier operating in the Pacific Theater. The transition represented more than simple equipment replacement. It marked a fundamental shift in American naval aviation doctrine from defensive operations focused on fleet protection toward offensive tactics designed to seize and maintain air superiority over enemy-controlled territory. The psychological impact on Japanese forces proved as significant as the material advantages American pilots enjoyed. Japanese training programs struggled to replace the experienced aviators lost during 2 years of attrition combat. The 1,000-hour pilots who had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor were dying faster than training schools could produce replacements. New Japanese pilots arriving at forward bases carried barely 300 hours of flight time, far less than the minimum requirements that had characterized pre-war training standards. These replacement aviators faced American opponents who benefited from standardized training programs that emphasized coordinated tactics over individual skill, creating systematic approaches to aerial combat that proved more effective than relying on pilot expertise alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would represent the culmination of tactical and technological advantages that had accumulated since the Hellcat's introduction 9 months earlier. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, assembled the largest concentration of carrier aviation assets remaining to the Imperial Navy. 9 aircraft carriers embarked 473 aircraft, representing nearly every operational fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo plane available for fleet operations. The Japanese plan relied on achieving surprise through night maneuvering that would position their carriers within striking range of American forces supporting the invasion of Saipan. Land-based aircraft operating from Guam and Rota would supplement carrier strikes, creating combined attacks that Japanese planners believed could overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. The strategy assumed that American fighters remained vulnerable to coordinated attacks executed by numerically superior forces operating from multiple directions simultaneously. What Japanese planning had failed to adequately address was the transformation that had occurred in American fighter capabilities and tactical doctrine since the war began. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, deployed 15 aircraft carriers, embarking 891 aircraft, including 480 F6F Hellcats, organized into squadrons that had spent months perfecting coordinated combat techniques. The American pilots possessed advantages in training, aircraft performance, and tactical coordination that would prove decisive when the fleets made contact. June 19, 1944, dawned clear over the Philippine Sea. Visibility unlimited beyond 100 miles in the crystal air that characterized Pacific high-pressure systems. American radar operators detected the first Japanese strike at 0700 hours, 69 aircraft approaching from the west at altitudes between 18,000 and 24,000 feet. The tactical response demonstrated the systematic approach that had evolved from 9 months of combat experience. Fighter director officers aboard American carriers coordinated intercepts that positioned Hellcat formations between incoming Japanese strikes and the fleet they were attempting to attack. The American fighters held altitude advantage, operating at 25,000 feet where their superior high-altitude performance could be fully exploited. Radio communication enabled rapid tactical adjustments as Japanese formations attempted to maneuver for favorable attack positions. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu, now an experienced combat veteran with 16 confirmed victories, led a division of 4 Hellcats toward the approaching Japanese formation. At 22,000 feet, he could distinguish individual aircraft types in the enemy strike force. 42 Yokosuka dive bombers, escorted by 27 Zero fighters, organized in loose formations that suggested the pilots lacked the extensive training that had characterized Japanese naval aviation during the war's opening phase. WWII coordinated his attack through hand signals, diving on the Japanese formation from a position that brought his division down at 45 degrees from above and behind. At 600 yards, all 4 Hellcats opened fire simultaneously, their combined output delivering enough ammunition to destroy 2 dive bombers before the Japanese pilots realized they were under attack. The tactical coordination that American pilots had practiced repeatedly proved devastatingly effective against formations composed of inexperienced aviators attempting to execute complex attack procedures. The engagement expanded rapidly as additional Hellcat divisions entered the battle, creating a 3-dimensional combat area that stretched across 20 miles of airspace. Japanese pilots attempting to organize defensive responses found themselves engaged by American fighters attacking from multiple directions, preventing the tactical cohesion necessary for effective counteraction. Every attempt to turn and fight resulted in Hellcats accelerating away, climbing to re-establish energy advantage, then returning for additional high-speed attack runs that Japanese formations could not evade. WWII's personal tally reached 6 aircraft destroyed during the 18-minute engagement, bringing his confirmed victory total to 22 kills. More significantly, his division had functioned as a single tactical unit throughout the battle, maintaining mutual support while executing coordinated attacks that maximized their combined firepower. The systematic approach that characterized American fighter operations had proven more effective than relying on individual pilot skill, validating training doctrine that emphasized teamwork over personal expertise. The first Japanese strike lost 42 of 69 aircraft before any reached attack positions against American ships. The second wave, 128 aircraft launched 2 hours later, suffered even more catastrophic losses. Approximately 100 aircraft were destroyed by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, while fewer than 30 succeeded in attacking the fleet without achieving significant damage. The third and fourth Japanese strikes fared similarly, with American fighters and ship-based defenses creating an impenetrable screen that prevented effective attacks against the invasion forces. By the end of June 19th, Japanese carrier aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a viable combat force. 346 carrier aircraft had been destroyed in a single day of combat, representing nearly 75% of Ozawa's embarked air groups. Land-based aircraft operating from Guam contributed an additional 50 losses, creating a combined total that exceeded 400 aircraft destroyed. American losses numbered 29 fighters, yielding a kill ratio that approached 14-1. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate tactical results. American pilots returning to their carriers reported engagements where Japanese formations had disintegrated under attack without mounting effective resistance. The invincible enemy that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor had been reduced to inexperienced pilots flying obsolete aircraft against opponents possessing overwhelming advantages in training, technology, and tactical coordination. The confidence that Japanese naval aviation had projected since the war began had evaporated completely, replaced by recognition that American forces now controlled the aerial battlefield with authority that could not be challenged. The statistical analysis, compiled after the battle, revealed the cumulative impact of advantages that had been building since the Hellcat's introduction. The F6F compiled a kill ratio of 19-1, shooting down 5,216 enemy aircraft while sustaining only 270 losses in air-to-air combat. 307 Navy Hellcat pilots achieved ace status with 5 or more aerial victories, more than any other aircraft in the Pacific theater. But the numbers themselves told only part of the story. The Hellcat had enabled tactical transformation that extended beyond individual aircraft capabilities. American fighter doctrine evolved from defensive formations focused on protecting bombers toward offensive operations designed to seize air superiority through systematic destruction of enemy aviation. The vertical battlefield became American territory, with superior high-altitude performance enabling tactical flexibility the Japanese pilots could not match. The industrial advantage proved equally decisive. Between 1943 and 1945, Grumman's Bethpage facility produced 12,275 Hellcats, overwhelming Japanese production capacity by margins that enabled American commanders to accept loss rates that would have been catastrophic for enemy forces. The quantitative superiority combined with qualitative advantages in aircraft performance and pilot training created conditions where Japanese victory became mathematically impossible regardless of tactical skill or strategic planning. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea engagement saw the remnants of Japanese carrier aviation withdrawn to bases beyond American reach, ending their effectiveness as a strategic force. The kamikaze tactics that emerged during subsequent months represented desperate attempts to negate American air superiority through suicide attacks that required no pilot skill beyond basic flight proficiency. The transformation from elite fighter forces dominating Pacific skies to desperate measures, sacrificing pilots and aircraft for minimal tactical gain, marked the complete collapse of Japanese naval aviation as an effective combat arm. For pilots like Duncan and Vracheu, the victory represented vindication of tactical doctrine developed through months of combat experience. The techniques that had proven effective against individual Japanese formations during isolated engagements had scaled successfully to fleet-level operations involving hundreds of aircraft. The systematic approach to aerial combat that emphasized coordination over individual heroics had transformed American fighter operations into integrated weapon systems capable of achieving decisive results against any opposition. The technical specifications that had made the Hellcat effective remained straightforward: a powerful engine maintaining performance at high altitude, structural strength permitting high-speed maneuvers that lighter aircraft could not match, sufficient armor and firepower to ensure survival and lethality during combat engagements. But the true advantage emerged from how these characteristics were employed through tactical doctrine specifically designed to maximize American strengths while minimizing Japanese advantages. The historical irony proved inescapable. Japanese pilots who had dominated Pacific skies through superior maneuverability and extensive training found themselves systematically defeated by opponents flying heavier fighters using tactics that avoided turning combat where zero advantages could dominate. The vertical battlefield the Japanese doctrine had controlled through superior climb rates became American territory when Hellcats demonstrated the ability to match or exceed zero performance above 15,000 feet. The psychological dominance that Japanese aviation had projected since Pearl Harbor collapsed when American pilots repeatedly demonstrated that proper tactics and superior aircraft could negate every advantage Japanese training and doctrine provided. The transformation extended beyond immediate tactical victories to influence post-war aviation development. The lessons learned from Hellcat operations informed fighter design and tactical doctrine for decades, establishing principles that remained relevant through the jet age and beyond. The emphasis on coordinated formations, energy management, and exploitation of aircraft performance advantages became foundational concepts taught to aviators operating supersonic fighters in conflicts far removed from the Pacific campaign. For Japanese aviation, the encounter with the Hellcat's high-altitude capabilities marked the end of an era. The Zero, designed for maneuverability and range at the expense of armor and high-altitude performance, had proven perfect for the war Japanese strategists expected to fight. But the conflict that actually emerged demanded characteristics the Zero could not provide, while American industry produced aircraft specifically designed to counter Japanese capabilities. The tactical framework that had made Japanese naval aviation invincible during the war's opening phase became a liability when facing opponents who refused to fight on Japanese terms. The individual story of Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda, shot down by a Hellcat during what should have been a routine climbing attack, represented thousands of similar encounters where Japanese pilots discovered that fundamental assumptions about American fighter capabilities were catastrophically wrong. The climbing loop that had destroyed 9 American Wildcats failed completely against an opponent that could match zero climb rates at altitudes where Japanese tactics depended on superior vertical performance. The broader strategic implications extended to Japan's ability to conduct naval operations throughout the Pacific. With carrier aviation effectively destroyed as a combat force, Japanese fleet operations became dependent on surface combatants operating without air cover against opponents possessing overwhelming aerial superiority. The decisive fleet engagement that Japanese doctrine had anticipated since before the war became impossible to achieve when American fighters controlled the sky above any potential battle space. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered unconditionally to Allied forces, the F6F Hellcat had established itself as the most successful naval fighter in history. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had initially dismissed as another American attempt to build fighters like bombers had proven to be exactly the weapon needed to achieve air superiority over the Pacific. The tactical innovations developed by American pilots and commanders, combined with industrial capacity that overwhelmed Japanese production, had created conditions where enemy victory became impossible, regardless of courage or tactical skill. The legacy transcended individual achievement or technological advantage. The Hellcat represented systematic approaches to warfare that treated aerial combat as engineering problems requiring coordinated solutions rather than individual duels depending on pilot heroics. The transformation from defensive tactics focused on protecting friendly forces toward offensive operations designed to seize air superiority through systematic destruction of enemy aviation established patterns that would characterize American military aviation for generations. From the morning of October 5, 1943, when a Japanese Zero pilot discovered that his climbing attack failed against an opponent that could match his vertical performance, emerged recognition that the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. American technology, industrial capacity, and tactical doctrine had combined to create overwhelming advantages that Japanese forces could not counter through traditional methods. The psychological dominance that Japanese aviation had projected since Pearl Harbor evaporated in the face of repeated defeats that demonstrated American superiority across every dimension of aerial warfare. The Hellcat's ability to outclimb the Zero above 15,000 feet represented more than a simple performance advantage. It marked the negation of tactical doctrine that Japanese naval aviation had perfected over decades, creating conditions where experienced pilots flying proven aircraft found themselves systematically defeated by opponents using techniques specifically designed to exploit American strengths while avoiding Japanese advantages. The vertical battlefield that had been Japanese territory since the war began became an American domain when engineering and tactical innovation combined to produce aircraft and doctrine capable of matching then exceeding enemy capabilities in the areas where they had previously dominated. The lesson proved enduring. Superior technology alone could not ensure victory, but when combined with appropriate tactical doctrine and overwhelming industrial capacity, it created advantages that even the most skilled opponents could not overcome. The transformation from American defensive operations, characterized by unfavorable kill ratios during the war's opening phase, to systematic dominance that achieved 19-to-1 exchange rates by 1944, demonstrated what became possible when all elements of military power aligned toward common objectives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.